Hey everybody, Jared here. I wanted to talk a little bit about this 1619 project because I heard it over the last year or so and I didn't really know anything about it, and so I thought I'd research it. I actually printed off a bunch of paperwork for it and read it over the last few weeks, the actual 1619 project. So now I feel like I have a little bit better understanding on it, but I'm just going to tell you that first of all, it's categorically incorrect. It's misleading and it's openly biased. I would even put it in a political category. At least it's being used politically. In my opinion, it's a perfect example of historical revisionism. It's written fairly well, kind of fictional, but it is interesting. It makes it kind of an interesting read. The basic premise of it is that America began in 1619 instead of in 1776. In 1619 is the year when the first slaves arrived from Africa. It is as if America was built on the backs of a specific race instead of the unifying work of all. Is slavery wrong? Of course slavery is wrong, but to base the entire framework, formation, foundation of this great country on one unbelievably horrific fact that a portion of it was built and happened as a result of slavery happening during those years is wrong. It's not like it's a either or. We don't have to say that by saying that this simply isn't the accurate history of the United States, we're not also saying that there is something right about slavery. So don't misconstrue that. The 1619 Project asserts that the framers openly supported slavery, which is an interesting point, and one that is debated quite a bit because a lot of the framers did have slaves. So it's an interesting challenge. One of the questions that I would bring up for it, though, is why does the Declaration of Independence, not just the U.S., but also all the states, specifically the 13 colonies, also include some indication that all people were equally valued? In the Declaration of Independence, it says all men are created equal, but each of the states also had their own version of that said something similar. There is an argument that some people would say that the framers didn't see black people, black Americans, as either Americans nor as people, which would indicate why they could have a declaration that says all people are created equal. These men, a lot of these men were Christians. Most of them feared God in some manner or another, and to think that they thought or had any inclination that a person with a different skin color simply wasn't human or wasn't a person is not rational. Some of the framers did own slaves, which obviously, as I've mentioned, openly disagrees with what I'm saying, but we must put this in context. Many of us have supported or participated in things in our culture that may have been found to be distasteful. For example, there's been a lot of talk over the last couple years about Blackface costumes that were common maybe 20, 30 years ago and prior for a significant period of time. And those raised a lot of controversy. Now, at the time they didn't. At the time people weren't saying, oh, at least I don't think it was commonplace for people to say that was racist. I think there were a lot of things that people did over time that as we look back on them now, we probably, all of us, cringe a little bit, and I think that's partly because the reality of what they were doing or what they were making fun of, but also just because of the environment that we're in now where we tend to be, I guess, a little more woke to those kind of things or more sensitive to that. In terms of how it might make other people feel. So I guess there are some good elements of that and some bad. I think the point is that we all participate in and do things at certain periods of our lives that don't maybe we become wiser at some point in the future. Maybe an example would be cigarette smoking. You know, a lot of people smoke cigarettes. Maybe 40, 50 years ago, they might have even said, hey, I don't see that there's anything wrong with this. Certainly at some point it became obvious that there was something wrong with it, but a certain portion of people still continue to smoke even after that, knowing what the effects are, potential cancer causing and all kinds of other issues. Same thing with food. As our diets have degraded over our progressive culture, people are woed into eating things that God frankly never designed us to eat, and they expect their bodies to remain healthy in the midst of, you know, dehydration and massive toxicity, and then in the end we hope that somehow we can take a pill or maybe go see the doctor and like fix years of ill choices that got us to a place physically where we're simply not healthy. So at some point we have to have this awakening. We have to have this realization that, hey, maybe these things are not right. My point is there are countless examples of how we do things at one point in our life, and then later, you know, we may do things in our driving habits as teens, not today of course, but maybe back when I was a teen, that we would kind of not take those risks now. Or maybe with other factors when we're younger, you know, maybe jumping off of a fence and doing things that you maybe wouldn't do as you get older and more mature and you realize that you can get hurt. With slaves, it's interesting because the alternative at the time was, do we focus on unification to ensure that the states become united and not become a broken, fighting, dejected, sporadic, kind of cracked Europe, from where they learned most of what they knew, what the framers knew about setting up a nation, which is quite the daunting task, and they did an amazing job, and our foundation has been put to the test many times as it is today. So the question is do we fight for the abolishment of slavery right now, or do we fight for the unification of the states and to ensure that we can protect ourselves from the rest of the world and in fact disconnect ourselves in many ways from the controls of the rest of the world, you know, Britain over certain parts, even Spain, France, I think over Florida, and different states kind of had their segregation when their ties to other countries and things. Can we break apart from all those, and then can we also unify to become one force to be able to protect ourselves? You know, the founding formation of the U.S. Navy was as a result of the Barbary pirates, which most of the other more mature countries had paid off, the North African pirates, and the United States simply couldn't afford to pay the ransoms, and so they essentially created the U.S. Navy and started using force to protect themselves. So in a unified America, in a unified United States, they can do those sort of things. So again, the question is do we focus on the abolishing slavery, or do we focus on building a great nation, a united States, a united front? And the obvious answer with that is that we focus on building union, and then we fix that union over time. And one of those things was abolishing slavery, which many people, John Adams, for example, comes to mind, who worked tirelessly for a good portion of his life to abolish slavery. And of course, Lincoln, who eventually, in the midst of attempting to maintain unification of the nation, also cost him his life not long after his second term, which is an interesting little bit of history. For those of you who like to point to the Republican Party and complain about racism and especially in slavery, you know, Lincoln surrounded himself with a lot of people who didn't necessarily believe the same way he did. It's very interesting. A good friend of mine was just telling me this story recently. And he chose a running mate as vice president for his second term that was actually a Democrat and quite liberal. He may have called himself a Republican, but he certainly was not in practice. And when Lincoln was assassinated, obviously his running mate took over, and what happened is obviously the Civil War had been completed, and there's a saying, 40 acres and a mule, that was actually true. They were actually taking these now freed slaves, and they were giving them 40 acres and a mule so that they could work the land and produce for themselves and make something of their life. And when Lincoln was assassinated and the new president came into the vice president came into the presidency, they essentially shut that all down, and they took the land back, and that essentially started this cascade of negative events for Black Americans again for many years to come. Had that not happened, the question, I guess, in this discussion I was having with a friend of mine is, you look at these inflection points in our history and you wonder, what if this wouldn't have happened and this could have happened? And the big one for me is that fateful night when Washington was leading the troops across the Delaware, and they're freezing, and their feet are coming out of their boots, and it's just they're marching through the night. I think it was on Christmas Eve. It's just astounding how close we were to not even having a nation, and it's really, really quite interesting. So back to the 1619 project. It's futile and incorrect to argue that Black Americans did not play a significant role in the work of building America. Of course they did, and of course slavery was also part of that, and it is part of our history. It is also unhelpful to focus on the ills of the past without also recognizing the improvements. Yes, many of the framers did own slaves, and maybe were even supportive of slavery. The Union would not have come together if the Northerners, or those who were anti-slavery, would have mandated that. We would have ended up with at least two countries. And many people, I think, could certainly argue with that, and would definitely have ground to stand on. In my opinion, I think they would eventually lose. I think the value of the Union was more important. Now, were there other ways they could have skinned the cat in terms of negotiating for various human rights things and different things that they could have done for the slaves? Probably. But the South was very vigilant and incredibly stoic in their demand to not have a mandate on slavery. And I was just thinking back, I was talking about something about Republicans versus Democrats. I guess I did explain it with the vice president coming in and becoming president, in terms of how that happened. It's always been the Democrats promoting segregation. It's always been the Republicans fighting for freedom and justice and liberty and unity and the belief that God created all of us in equal terms. Okay. I think I said it's unhelpful to focus on the ills of the past without also recognizing the improvements that we've made as a country and as a community. Much ground has been made up, and clearly there's universal desire for the for the elimination of all racism. Some of the things that were done to Black Americans through the building of this nation are horrific. The same could be said of Indians and of women. There are also examples of white men being horribly abused. Read about Isaac Woodward's story of coming home from serving in the military and being beaten so badly that he was blind for the rest of his life. He was only 26 at the time, hadn't even made it home yet, and was beaten unfortunately by some police officers in the South outside of Atlanta, and just an utterly shattering, sad story. This was a man who fought for our country, and this is how he's treated when he was brought home. I think the thing that this should highlight is the potential depravity that we have as humanity. Those that remain today should not be held liable for the sins of those that have gone before us. Racism is propagated when people fill the air with excessive talk of it. That leads to entitlement and degradation of one's life if they see themselves in a certain category that may or may not even exist any longer. Although racism is horrible, it's not illegal, and it would be a mistake to try to use legislation to do so, as that would tread on the free will of all colors, all skin colors. How we combat this is through our teaching and by allowing our history to be, not allowing our history to be revised to fit the narrative that simply is not true. It's called having integrity. It's called focusing on the family and not attacking the family unit. How we combat this is through a personal relationship with an almighty God that gives us the ability to take control of our emotions and to think rationally and to have moral constraints and moral obligations. The point of this message is simply to highlight a bit about what I understand the 1619 Project to be about, to point out the false narrative that it portrays and to move the emphasis to how we are better as a result of our collective work to fight evil in our midst. Additionally, it's important to note that the current Black Lives Matter movement is completely disassociated with the realities of what it means to be Black American and have experienced in this country. Their position is political and it's evil. Do not be duped into believing that there is some connection between the two other than both do involve Black Americans. I'm talking about the connection between BLM and slavery. I'm confident that all Americans that have suffered horribly to form this nation would be utterly disgusted with what BLM movement is attempting to leverage for their evil endeavors. Let me ask you this. If BLM really cared about Black people, how about the Black police chief who was killed in Minneapolis or whatever during the riots? How about the fact that in 2020 more Black babies were aborted in the state of New York than Black babies that were born in the state of New York? Let that one sink in. How about the fact that just yesterday 45 American kids were stopped and captured that were headed for human trafficking? Where's that on the news? That's just one day. The 1619 Project will be pushed as a true piece of history, but there is very little of it that is anything other than fiction as a result of the way it's packaged. They have taken many true historical events and put a spin on it that simply is nothing more than historical revisionism. America was founded in 1776 on the backs of all patriots at the time, and those people include many different skin colors. This great nation has worked tirelessly and relentlessly to remove all forms of racism and equality since that day. Has there been mistakes, setbacks, and pure evil? For sure, but the overwhelming result is that we have a country where this entire world desires to be. People of all colors want to come to America because this is the land of the free. This is the land of the liberty. This is the land of opportunity. Keep going, America. You really are great.